All right, we're back. So today I'm going to be talking about the dungeons I like and the dungeons I don't like in a tier list format. So basically, we're going to be going through, and it's been about 5 weeks now, and so I think I've had enough time to play with these dungeons pretty comprehensively. In addition to that, I've done like hundreds of beta keys at this point as well. So I've had a lot of experiences with pretty much all the dungeons, and I feel like I can pretty confidently rate them on a tier list to the point of things that I like and things that I don't like about each and every single dungeon, and kind of talk through the process of like why I like some of the things I like and why I don't like some of the things I don't like. Ultimately, what you kind of need to know is that a lot of my experiences do come from like a higher end player base. I think that players who are predominantly pugging are probably gonna have different experiences, particularly with dungeons like Necrotic Wake or something like that, where I think that, Surgeon Stitchflesh is a pain in the ass for pugs, like literally impossible to kill for pugs. But for iron players, sometimes you can kill the boss. Not like it's a great boss or anything, but I think that, there are some of these things that are less challenging for higher end players than they are for, the average player. I think that Skarmorax and Stonevault is another great example of an encounter that's kind of in that same vein where it's like, it's doable, manageable high end players. Not still not great, but like, pugs are going to find that fight to be like 10 times the challenge of high end players. All right, let's start at the top of the list. I think by far the best dungeon this season, my favorite is going to be Ara-Kara. I think the pull sizing, kind of like the interesting stuff that you can do with routes sometimes in this dungeon, makes this dungeon pretty cool. I think the first area, how you're doing some of the pulls where you're pulling all the way up to the mini boss, you're pressing your lust and you're like kind of nuking all of those mobs down. That's interesting. There's also starting to be some developments with what you can actually do with the tailoring buff in this dungeon and what mobs you can and can't stun, with the discovery that you can actually have pressing roar the stun on pretty much every single elite mob inside of this dungeon as well. You're able to get like an 18-second long stun from the tailoring buff, and I think that also makes Ara-Kara pretty cool. I think that some of the stuff that's like really cringe about Ara-Kara, and in a pug situation, you would complain about this a lot more. Like the last boss, especially if you don't have a lot of decurses, or if you're running a bunch of heavy melee comp, they're going to kill one another in a lot of pug situations. Whereas for high-end players, they kill one another substantially less. It's not that it never happens, but it just happens a lot less. I don't find that boss is egregious. I do think that the first boss of the dungeon is probably the biggest deterrent for me, just in terms of how this dungeon feels to play. If you have a couple of ranged in this dungeon, the first boss feels very different than if you have a couple of melee in this dungeon. And I think that that's probably the biggest deterrent of this entire dungeon. I also think that, I don't love the hulking blood guards just as like a mob. I think that they could have gone with a better mob. I think that they could have maybe picked some better mob selection for like the second area. But I think that this is by far my favorite dungeon to play. Every single time I see, Ara-Kara in our bags, this is the dungeon that I want to go to for the entire season. And I find this dungeon to be the most fun and just kind of the most interesting for what we are actually seeing with the season. Next up, I have Dawnbreaker. So Dawnbreaker in the beta was incredibly overtuned, and they've ended up retuning it a lot. The thing that I like about Dawnbreaker the most, I think, is that it has the most selection in terms of what mobs you can and can't pull. Of course, there are some packs that are determined, like, the first couple pulls of the dungeon. The ending section is determined. But, the middle, I would say about 60% or 70% of the count that you're going to get is you can do it in like different orders. You can get it from different sources. Of course, you have to kill the mini bosses, but we've seen players playing some random packs out in the courtyard. I saw Yoda do the most random pull in the courtyard earlier with some mobs that I didn't ever really expect to be pulled. We've seen some of the Chinese teams like back routing and pulling like a triple pack and just like flying around the dungeon in a bunch of different ways. And I think that they actually do dragon riding pretty well in this dungeon. I think it's a lot better than like what No Coup Defensive was in terms of dragon riding. And I think that the cool part of the Dawnbreaker for me is, just the routing in general. And I think that, some of the pulls that you're doing in there feel relatively fun. Now they are challenging, but they are, in my opinion, fun. Downside of the Dawnbreaker is I think the last boss is absolute complete garbage. I think that like I would be looking to rework that fight. I think that the fact that nobody knows what percentage that it's killed at is really cringe. I mean, I understand how to determine it. Like, you don't have to tell me in the comment section, but like the fact that it's not very clear as to what percentage that boss dies at, the fact that boss isn't very good, I think that is a pretty big red flag for me. I also just, some of the beginning stuff, I'm just like not super hot on. The first 10-ish minutes of Dawnbreaker just in general. Now, I talked about the middle 15 minutes of that dungeon being pretty cool, but the beginning 10 is not my favorite part of the dungeon just in general, and I think that kind of weighs it down a little bit. But I do in general think that Dawnbreaker is pretty cool. I think that some of this stuff as well, with like the debuffs from the mini bosses being put onto players, especially with how hard hitting those debuffs are, is also maybe not the greatest. I find that to be a pretty frustrating mechanic. But overall, Dawnbreaker, A tier dungeon for me. Other A tier dungeon, I missed a tier in Scythe. I would maybe be looking to put this in B. I think this is like my quintessential like mid dungeon, but I think in terms of like the rest of the field, I think that this dungeon probably belongs in A. Not necessarily like I don't have the most fun whenever I'm playing Mists ever, because there's a lot of stuff that like artificially slows you down. I think the maze for some people can be particularly cool, but I think for a player like me, I want like choice and decision making with the dungeon, and I think that having actual walls inside of the dungeon completely limit what you can and can't do is incredibly frustrating. I think that some of the mobs that they've redesigned, like the guardians and the defenders, are so annoying. I think that getting expelled and your tank getting absolutely smoked, it just doesn't feel that great in some aspects of it. But in general, I think it's hard to like dock a bunch of points from it because it doesn't do anything that's like too egregious in my mind. I think it's like incredibly average. The bosses are mostly fine. The trash is mostly fine. The end of the dungeon is mostly fine. I don't think anything is like I'm having the most fun whenever I'm playing this. This is the most interesting stuff, but I don't think that it's got like huge drawbacks to the point where I don't want to go there. I think that there's a decent amount of dungeons sometimes where I'm just like, I'm not having fun whenever I'm playing it. Not that I'm like unhappy with playing the game, but I just don't find that dungeon particularly engaging or compelling whenever I'm going there. Now, what I will say is the invisible swirlies on the last boss and the fact that they insta-tick you is completely out of control and has to get fixed. That has to be one of the most frustrating mechanics to me, and it makes me so annoyed whenever I die to something like that. Next up, we got City of Threads. I would put City of Threads in B tier. I actually think the beginning of City of Threads and the end of City of Threads is really cool. I think that the downsides of this dungeon are, the 2-target fight, I'm not like in love with. I think the big RP section, though, is kind of similar to the Mist Maze. I'm actually moving Mist down to B tier, the top of B, after thinking about it a little bit more. Kind of for similar reasons, the middle section of City of Threads, where you're running around and doing all that RP, that to me feels completely pointless. And it kind of feels like you're waiting in traffic, more or less, where you're just trying to get to your destination, you're trying to go back home from a long day's work, and you watch this timer tick down, and you're sitting in traffic because you have to do this long RP that doesn't feel very rewarding. And what are you rewarded with? You're rewarded by killing 3 mini bosses that activate the second boss, and it's just like, oh, I'm really thankful that I wasted 5 minutes. I think that the trash design in this dungeon is actually pretty solid. There's not a lot of decision making that you're going to be making with this dungeon just in general, where you can pull some different stuff, but a lot of the packs have heavy casters, like the heralds at the very beginning and the silken mages. They don't really let you pull those packs together, and I think that that's like a pretty big detriment, because you would have to have something like 7 interrupts to be able to actually kick some of these packs. And so some of these packs are in theory doable, but they're landmine packs in the sense of if you pulled them, you're probably going to be wiping, and so like don't accidentally pull them, because otherwise you're going to be dying to them. So there is choice, but it's kind of an illusion of choice, more or less, I think, with some of the City of Threads packs in the dungeon. But I think in general, the dungeon's okay. I'm not like super upset whenever I see City of Threads. In fact, I think I'm like pretty okay with it, especially considering some of the remaining dungeons that we have down here. Stonevault, I think, is like marginal B or C for me. I'm probably going to put this in C, but I think that Stonevault's like pretty marginal. You can only do so much in this dungeon just in general, and that's kind of why I'm leaning towards C. There's only so many interesting routes that you can play in Stonevault. I think that linear dungeons are incredibly limited just in general in terms of what I personally find fun with them, and so in that regard, I think that Stonevault actually does an okay job with some of its trash. I think that the non-elites hitting your tank way too hard is kind of unacceptable. But beyond that, the trash is like more or less okay. I think the charge mobs being a bit buggy with their arrow is annoying. The rock smasher mobs with the smash rock ability at the end of the dungeon, I think that I personally, kind of similar to the Mists of Tyranid Scythe ending with the staghorns, hate abilities that really limit your creativity in terms of like what mobs you can pull together. And it happens in Stonevault, it happens in Mists. There's somewhere else that also has this like stacking debuff thing. The Herald at the end of Ara-Kara has the same mechanic too, where it's just like infinite stacking debuff. I don't love those mechanics. I think that those are pretty obnoxious in Mythic Plus situations, and you end up not wanting to pull those mobs because of that. I think the big deterrent to Stonevault to me is Skarmorax, and yeah, mostly Skarmorax. I don't love the last boss. I think the last boss is pretty poorly designed because I just don't think it's very engaging. But I think that Skarmorax is like a huge, just like thumbs down for me. It's kind of everything that's like wrong with Mythic Plus bosses that have a shield, that shield themselves on a timer. You know, you have to kill all these ads that are in a specific window, and then you get a shielded boss, and then you end up having this fight that ends up lasting 5 minutes. Of course, they're nerfing the HP of the boss on the reset, but like, dude, it's kind of like what was that boss from the other side? Hakar. It's kind of like Hakar from the other side, kind of similar vibe, where you just like spiral out of control when you get too many shields, and the next thing you know, you end up with a 5-minute fight. And of course, this is just like a high-end problem, but I see pugs all the time where they don't understand like the orb mechanic and how you're actually supposed to be dealing with the orb mechanic, and that to me is incredibly frustrating. And I think that fight is just super annoying, not very intuitive, just in general. And so I got Stonevault in C tier. Got Grim Batol next for me personally. I'm gonna put Grim Batol in C. I think it's okay. It's kind of similar to Stonevault, where the trash isn't like the greatest thing ever, and the bosses aren't like spectacular. But I don't think that they're like so egregious that I need to punish it by putting it in like a lower rank than C. I think it's like okay. Like, it's not that I'm unwilling to play the dungeon. I think that's kind of the distinction that I'm looking to make with like a C and like a D tier here, is like I don't mind Grim Batol as much. I think the cannon bombarding thing is what people were really worried about whenever they were bringing Grim Batol back. I actually don't mind that part of the dungeon. I think in general the issue that I have with Grim Batol is like the design of the mobs. The mobs that cast the Ascension at the very end, like that mob is like pretty annoying. You know, the faceless corruptors that are at the end of the dungeon are fairly annoying. I think that the dragons are just incredibly frustrating as well. The fact that they knock you back, you know, there's so many knockbacks this season on all players, but the fact that those dragons also knock you back, and so it's basically like line or get hit for your entire health bar, that to me is pretty obnoxious. I also think that the fact that there's so many casters in this dungeon just in general, whether it's the Earthshapers in the beginning, whether it's the Beguilers in the middle, whether it's the Warlocks and the Beguilers towards the end, like that to me, it's just like a incredibly stressful dungeon start to finish. And then also the third boss of this dungeon. The third boss of this dungeon is one of my least favorite fights of the season. I think that the fact that I'm continuously getting knocked back, you have to like target swap these ads. Now people are like fighting with their head tucked into a corner because that's the best strat to be able to make the ads spawn well relative to how melee can even kill them. That it's just an incredibly frustrating boss to be able to deal with, on top of the fact that it has just like a ton of HP. Most pogs are going to end up having a lot of problems with like the final boss, but you know, for high-end groups, the final boss, I think the biggest issue is like the tentacles spawn too frequently, and it's kind of hard to tell if you're going to be standing in one or if you accidentally walk into one, especially relative to how big the boss is. But more often than not, you know, that mechanic is mostly fine for like high-end groups. But that third boss is just like huge points down for me. And so I think that the issue for me isn't necessarily that Stonevault has so many of these deterrent points, but it's more just like there's no high point to the dungeon. You know, Ara-Kara has like a high point of the dungeon. Dawnbreaker has a high point of the dungeon. You know, there's a Tyrannus in the city. Otherwise, they're kind of like, you know, they have some high points, but you know, Mist is like fairly mid through the entire key. City of Threats has some high points but some low points. Grim Batol, I don't think has any high points like at all. I think it's kind of similar to Mist of Tyrannus in that vein. But I think that Mist of Tyrannus through and through is like a better dungeon just design wise. Next are my final two dungeons, and I'm going to go Wake and Boralus in that order. So I'm talking about Necrotic Wake first. I think that this dungeon completely sucks. They increased the amount of count that's required, which reduced the creativity that you could do with the route. Now, they did end up nerfing the Gatekeeper damage and buffed the count that they give, which is nice, because then that gives you actual choice as to what you're pulling. But there's kind of a similar vein to some of the other dungeons that we talked about earlier. It's more of an illusion of choice than anything else, where, you know, you have to pull the gatekeepers to realistically be able to get count. You have to pull Narzuda, even though that mob sucks. Like, you don't want to be playing that mob, but you have to pull it, otherwise you're not really going to be able to get count. I also think that, you know, Surgeon Stitchflesh and now Thor are huge pain points for me. I think that those bosses are some of the worst designed fights I've ever fought. Now Thor, in a similar vein to Hakar, in a similar vein to Skarmorax, the fact that it just sends one player down all the time, and the best thing that you can possibly be doing is having a Warlock that can drop a gate to where somebody can gate the Exile, or having an Augavoker, or having a Priest, that way they can grip the Exile target, and you just eat the 15-second death penalty to keep somebody up top, is absurd. I think that Surgeon Stitchflesh, the fact that you have to commit triple spear, which is getting fixed, by the way, but they're still not fixing the fact that you can't kill the A-bombs. The A-bombs are going to end up having too much HP, and the fight's still going to be brutal for most people. I think that fight just completely sucks. I think that Amarth is also way too caster heavy for like an average group, to the point where they're having mages with the Frostbolt Vault. Most pugs... Okay, so let's take my like general prog group. What we do is we rotate Warrior and double Shaman Interrupt on the boss. That way a Necrotic Bolt never goes off. Myself and the DK, I'm an Augavoker, and we have a Death Knight. We're on the two mages. What happens is the DK grips in the first mage that spawns, and he kicks the Frostbolt Volley. The second mage that spawns, I kick the Frostbolt Volley instantly, and then that mage walks into melee. Then those mages are just going to be casting Frostbolt onto random players if they go off, but I'm responsible for CCing them. Meanwhile, you know, like I talked about earlier, the tank and the two shamans are rotating interrupts on the boss. What pug is going to be doing that? And that fight still just sucks. It's really hard to deal with. You know, I think it's just like too kick heavy. I think that in general, I do like interrupts in dungeons. I think that interrupts can be a cool part of dungeons. I think that too much kick heavy stuff at the exact same time, especially whenever it can wipe you if one of the interrupts goes off, feels overly punishing. And I don't like Amarth for the same reasons. And I think that it having 3 very negative boss interactions for me makes me think that Necrotic Wake is not a very fun dungeon. And I find it so obnoxious whenever I deplete that key, because it never feels very fun. And I always end up depleting it to some stupid shit. And we're like, well, I guess we go again. And then I just turn a 14 Necrotic Wake into a 13 Necrotic Wake, and a 13 Necrotic Wake into a 12 Necrotic Wake. And I just always deplete that stupid ass key. And it's going into D tier because I'm really annoyed. Dumbass dungeon. Boralus, I very infrequently slam my desk. Siege of Boralus has caused me to slam my desk twice this season, and it's over some absolutely bullshit interactions. My issue with Siege of Boralus is particularly the trash. The Irontide Raider, whenever it grips you in, it shouldn't do damage to you. The Black Tar Bomber should not do nearly as much damage to you as it does. Chopper Red Hook, whenever he grips you in, shouldn't do as much damage to you as he does, because you're also getting comboed by the Powder Shot Bomb at the same time. And it's just an incredibly frustrating experience to have the first 10 minutes of this dungeon be praying that you don't get like one shot while you're getting gripped into a boss. And again, this is another knockback movement displacing effect that I'm talking about. And I find those incredibly annoying just in general. I also think the Monkey Town area is fairly frustrating just to deal with in general. There's just, you know, slipping on the banana, you have to dodge the crusher AoE with line of sight. That to me doesn't feel particularly engaging. And I think that, you know, the bosses, you know, the first boss is obnoxious. I think the first boss sucks, frankly. The other two bosses in this dungeon, or the other 3 bosses in this dungeon, aren't really that bad. They actually made Vic Goth more or less okay, but I still have a major issue with the Vic Goth tuning. Why does Putrid Waters actually hit you for any initial damage? Instead of the Putrid Waters hitting you for initial damage, the mechanic should be based around your healer actually dispelling you, and so it should still do dot damage whenever it's left on you. But it shouldn't do 80% of your health up front, or in my case, because I'm doing a high enough key, 100% of my health up front, to the point where I have to pre-defensive it before it gets shot from the boss. And then there's travel time, so I can't defensive it as I am able to actually tell that it's coming at me. I have to defensive it before it's actually shot from the boss, and have a defensive that's lasted long enough to be able to actually get the DR onto it. And that is just so stupid. And I think that this dungeon is completely beans. I think it's better than it was in BFA. That's no consolation. Like, oh, okay, it was terrible then and it's not great now. It's better, but not great. But yeah, I think that, you know, to me, there's just like these unsatisfying interactions that make me incredibly frustrated just to do the dungeon in general. And the only solace I know is that we're gonna wipe to some bullshit with the trash in the first 5 minutes of the dungeon and leave the key. That's the only solace I have with Siege of Boralus, because the dungeon sucks. Anyhow, those are my thoughts on all 8 dungeons this season. I wish I could get more Ara-Karas, because that dungeon is really cool. Yeah, in general, you know, I'm having fun playing the season. I think that a lot of people, they're going to see a video like this and be very negative. But in general, I've been having fun playing. Because to me, playing the dungeons is more about playing with the group of people that I'm having fun with, and less about the dungeons more or less being fun, if that makes any sense. I think it's more about a group experience that you're having with people that you're friends with, as opposed to, am I having fun with this dungeon pool? Because this dungeon pool, in my opinion, is not that great. Haven't been having a ton of fun, and I clocked it like a 3.5 coming into the season after a bunch of beta dungeons. I think a 3.5 is probably about right. It might be a 4, but I think a 3.5 is about right for this season for me personally. Anyways, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts down in the comment section below, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.